In every part of the world, there are courageous people taking a stand for liberty, often under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. Here on Freedom Worldwide, you'll meet inspiring leaders from around the globe and learn how they're partnering with our team at Atlas Network to strengthen their missions, to achieve crucial wins for individual rights in their countries, and to make the world a freer, more peaceful, and more prosperous place. I'm Tom Palmer, coming to you from Damascus, Syria, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Brussels, Belgium, San Jose, Costa Rica, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. This is Freedom Worldwide. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're on right now. I'm Tom Palmer with Atlas Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Freedom Worldwide. And today it's my special privilege to talk about the rise and fall of golden ages in human history with historian Johan Norberg. His latest book, Peak Human, What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages, is hot off the presses. It's an awesome read. It's been enthusiastically reviewed by The Economist, The Financial Times, and many other publications as perfect summer reading. And it is. It's a very engaging mix of narrative history with fascinating, illuminating details and a lot of deep insights from psychology, from economics, from anthropology, and other disciplines. So, Johan, let's get to the point. What's the book about in a nutshell?
Thank you, Tom, so much for the opportunity to talk about it. This is the story about the rise and fall of great civilizations in history, from ancient Athens and onwards. What made them great in the meaning that how did they create human flourishing and innovation, and why did they eventually peter out and lose their way, decline and fall?
Well, the question then is, why this book and why now?
Well, you know, it's sometimes said that a drowning man may see his whole life flash before him. Perhaps it's some kind of unconscious effort to find something within his own experience, in his past, to escape his impending doom. And I'm not saying that we're drowning right now, but the water is deep, and it makes sense to rehearse some swimming lessons and perhaps extend the lifespan of our present civilization and to avoid some of the mistakes of the past. I think we have some important lessons to learn.
So you think that we're possibly in danger of losing our golden age today?
I think there are some clear signs in our world today which remind me of the decline phase of some of these civilizations, how we turn away from innovation, exploration, discovery, and retreat, going back to the cave, shutting the world out and arming ourselves. And that's a worrying sign, at least.
You know, I often hold seminars for students and talk about the deep roots of civilization, and we end up talking about Greek civilization, obviously. And a lot of people in popular culture are exposed to the Spartans as somehow really great. So I've got a hot question for you. Sparta or Athens? So Sparta's long been especially popular among two groups, philosophers, Plato, all the way to Rousseau and many others. They loved the Spartans because of their discipline and order and the planned society, and then also violent gang members. So the far right in podcasts all around the world idolize Sparta. There's references to the Spartan warriors in the Battle of Thermopylae and so on. Well, you take that on and you debunk it in the very first chapter of the book. So what really went on, and to whom did the Greeks really owe their independence?
I'm glad you mentioned this because it really relates to your last question about worrying signs in the present, because Thucydides, the great Greek historian, he talked about the two different mindsets. One is the Athenian mindset of going out to explore, to find new opportunities, new partners, new friends, new trade opportunities, and the Spartan mindset, which is to wall yourself off from the rest of the world and fight them if there's any kind of exchange going on. And the fear that I have for our world is that we've slightly moved from the Athenian to the Spartan one. Well, I'm on the Athenian side for sure. The Athenians, they were, relatively speaking, open, democratic, curious. They invented the science of history, philosophy, rhetoric, comedy and tragedy, the great advances in sculpture, architecture, and economic growth. What did the Spartans ever do? They didn't leave us with anything like that. No literature, no poetry, no great architecture, only these sort of, as someone put it, only names of American football teams, because for some reason there are lots of stories about their warriors. But, this kind of authoritarian structure they had in Sparta didn't just mean that they weren't innovative in economics and in society. They weren't even innovative in warfare. So they tried the same thing over and over again. And when they failed, they tried it again until they eventually lost out. So we've got these fantasy stories about the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae fighting against the Persians. Well, that's a myth, probably a myth invented by an Athenian who wanted to create a myth about how brave they were to encourage other Spartans and other Greeks to fight against the Persians. What really happened was that they had this pass which should be impregnable. It shouldn't be possible for the Persians to invade, but the Spartans, they weren't just 300. They had a couple of other thousands of Greeks over there. They had forgotten to put men in an important pass, which meant that the Persians could surround them and attack them from behind. What really saved Greece back then were innovative, curious-minded trickster Athenians who didn't just fight off the Persians, but also invented the greatest myths about the Spartans.
Well, your book has not only these interesting details, but really vivid chapters sweeping across history. So you've got chapters on Athens, Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Middle East, Muslim civilization, Song Dynasty, China, then Renaissance Italy, the Dutch Republic, and then today's world, and what you call the Anglosphere. And then I presume also the wider, relatively globalized civilization that's interconnected on every continent. What are the distinctive traits of each of these golden ages in just a few words?
Well, it takes a lot of time if we're going to talk about each of these civilizations. So let's start in this way. What you've just mentioned, these civilizations, they were on different continents, different peoples, different faiths and mythologies. So it kind of proves that progress, flourishing, innovation is not based on the fate of a particular civilization. It's based on what they did. These were pagans, they were Muslims, they were Confucians, Catholics, Calvinists, Anglicans, they were secular, but they all held these ideas in a particular way, in a way that it wasn't an orthodoxy. They were so open that they encouraged the introduction of new ideas, methods, and innovations from new places. And that made them stronger. Some of them, most of them actually, were trade-based maritime societies like the Athenians, the Italians, the Dutch. So they found new ideas on their business trips and also saw things that forced them to rethink some of their ideas, telling them that there is more than one way. Others did it in other ways. The Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, 9th century Baghdad, they invited scholars from other faiths and learned from them and translated their books. The Romans in the Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire were quite brutal, but they also had a method of constantly absorbing new ideas and methods into their own body politic. Even talented people that had been conquered could make a career in the Roman army or the Senate. You could even make it to be an emperor if you were talented enough. And all of these things, in all of these places, because they were open, because they were curious, it made them stronger because they got access to more people's brains and ideas and talents and hard work than other contemporary civilizations.
Well, your book has so many interesting insights, but you've also written a number of other books. I loved your book, Open, for example, which came out before this one. It's just a remarkable book. And it's helped to give you a reputation as something of an evangelist of optimism, since your books and articles document so clearly the enormous progress of the past, let's say, 200, 250 years, compared to all that had gone before them. So violence is less common. We see violence, but in fact, the human experience of violence has fallen for thousands of years. Lives are longer, they're healthier, more children live to adulthood, billions of people have been lifted out of dire poverty. Yet, when we look out on the landscape, we see that much of what made that possible, so I think limited constitutional government, or liberal democracy as it's also known, freedom of speech and movement and trade, all those are under pretty systematic attack in today's world. So trade barriers going up, lots more protectionism than we've seen in the past, let's say, 50 years or so, often with the most, well, just irrational and contradictory justifications. On the one hand, they'll raise lots of revenue. On the other hand, they'll stop trade. It can't be both. It's one or the other. But we hear both out of the same mouths. And then also violent and aggressive dictatorships. I'm going to give a little bit of the pessimist side here, that are on the offense against democracies. Russia, Iran, but with support from China, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, now even Hungary. So what's the foundation for your optimism?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised all these threats to freedom and therefore also progress, because it makes it possible for me to qualify my optimism. Optimism is often misunderstood as some sort of complacency. You think that things will just work out well in the end, whatever people do, whether they listen to us or not. That's not really my kind of optimism. It's a qualified optimism. It comes from history. It tells me that if people have a certain degree of freedom and agency, they will surprise us by coming up with new, novel solutions to our old problems, and they will be able to deal with new challenges that they are facing. But they need that freedom in order to do that, in order to adapt, in order to improvise, to face new threats, whether it be surprises that nature throws at us, or authoritarian dictators, or our own governments encroaching on our liberties. We need some freedom to improvise, to adapt, to innovate. If we lose that freedom, it will be very hard indeed. And that's why I write my book. This is not my books. It's not a complacent optimism that things will just work out well, because in that case, I could just go out here in the Swedish countryside and spend time with fishing and swimming rather than talking about freedom. My optimism is based on the conviction that we can do this. We can make great things happen if we are allowed to do that. So we have to fight for our freedom in order to achieve this.
And partly about the power of ideas also to motivate people. If people are going to go out and explain these ideas, make a stand, be patient with people who don't understand the benefits of trade, the benefits of limited government, we can, in fact, defend what we've achieved and even make it much better. I take it that's where you're going.
Yes, I think so. I think that some of our ideas are quite counterintuitive, because part of human nature is fairly tribal. It's fairly zero-sum. People often think that if someone else benefits, whether it be the billionaires back home, or foreigners who trade with us, or immigrants who come to our country, it's our loss in some reason. The world, the economy is a zero-sum game. And that's partly because throughout most of humanity's history, we've lived in a zero-sum game. Growth, innovation on this scale, where we see it in the lifespan of the average person, is a new phenomenon. It came with the Industrial Revolution, and we should all be grateful for the fact that we live in this period when we have been able to reduce poverty and increase opportunity to this extent. But we should always be mindful of the fact that that's not where most of our mythologies, religion, ideas come from. They come from a much more precarious world where if someone else was much richer than you, he probably stole it from you. So we have to be a little bit patient with those arguments. The fear of trade, the fear of markets, openness, migration, because it's part of our own nature as well. So we have to make the case better, but in a friendly, nice, decent way.
Friedrich Hayek also made the point, which I think is related to this historical dimension, that we also have to live in two kinds of order at the same time. We grow up in the small, intimate order of the family. You know each other face to face. We develop a kind of set of moral principles, and then we go out into the great society, which is full of strangers. And those rules that govern the intimate group in which you know each other's abilities, whether someone is shirking or not is relatively easy to detect. And now we're out in the great society full of strangers, people who might not speak our language, they don't share our religion, and we have to interact with them according to abstract rules. And that's hard, to live in two kinds of orders at the same time. So part of our challenge is to explain the benefit of each. If you apply the rules of the abstract society to the intimate group, it would become soulless and heartless. It would be terrible. But when you try, as Marx proposed, to make it the human family, that's also unbearable and ends up just leading to tyranny and poverty. I'd like to point out go ahead there, Johan.
Well, that's an incredibly important point. You know, I would do anything for my children, and that's a good thing. But if I were to do anything for my children when I'm in government, that's corruption, and that undermines the opportunity for everybody else to do anything for their children. So that's why we need to live in both of these worlds at once, and we need them both.
Oh, that's very, very well put. I'd like to point out that people can pose questions if you want to. We'll have some opportunity for discussion with Johan. In addition to the aggressive threats of governments of Russia and China and Iran and authoritarian populism that's become popular in so much of the Western or democratic world, there's also something else that happens. And that's what we have to deal with on a daily basis. It doesn't matter whether you're in a golden age or a declining age. And that's all the accretion of special interests who oppose competition. They want government monopolies. They want protection for themselves. They don't want other people to be able to compete with them. They don't want innovation. They don't want people coming in and doing new things, taking their markets and so on. And generally, people who prefer to live off of the production of other people. Rent-seeking, as it's called in technical economics language. So how important are those threats, and what do you think can be done to defend against them?
Oh, I think this is incredibly important. You know, golden ages sometimes are lost because of one dramatic disaster or an invasion that ends it all. But oftentimes, the dynamic growing civilization just peters out eventually, and one reason is that we get this concentration of special interests who have built their power on a specific set of ideas and of production, and they don't want much change, and they want to control this process in order to benefit from it themselves. And it's incredibly hard to fight against it, because it's the old problem of any kind of intervention or corruption leads to concentrated benefits. So they would fight for it with tooth and nail. But the costs are dispersed among the whole of society, and the future costs as well. So who will speak up for that? We don't organize in order to wage battle against that. So who speaks up for the greater good and for the future? Well, the bad news is that has to be us. That's got to be us. That's why it's so important for us to take a more, not a special interest engagement in these fights, but an intellectual principled battle against these special interests that would undermine our liberties and our wealth. And, that's why I'm part of the liberty movement. That's one reason why I'm involved with many Atlas Network events and partners. And, when I do that, I see that there are so many people who fight in a way that's much more courageous and persistent than what I do back here in Sweden or the US. And seeing that energy, that willingness to stand up for free competition, for principles, for constitutional government against these special interests, that brings me hope that even though the rent seekers are always out there for their own benefits, there's always somebody else out there speaking for the broader interest of freedom and of opportunity in the future as well.
One thing I know, you've been a headliner at some of the Atlas Network events, the Freedom Dinner that we hold, and the various regional liberty forums around the world. You're always a big hit. I remember one of the great lines that you said at an Atlas Network dinner when you spoke. You talked about the huge advances, the progress that people have experienced, longer lives, less sickness. You went into detail, all the things people suffered from in the past that no one could imagine having today. And you said, when you get this news, it's like being hit over the head with a rainbow. It's a very memorable way of putting about it, and it helped to put me in a more optimistic mood also. I should mention for our viewers that our Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner will be November 12th and 13th in Manhattan. And I encourage everyone, after this is done, to go to atlasnetwork.org after this podcast and register. It's just a great opportunity to meet so many awesome people and to see the ideas of liberty, but also the people who make it possible celebrated and recognized for their accomplishments and for what they do to make the world more free, more peaceful, and more prosperous. Well, let me come back then to the book. That's the topic of our discussion. How do you define a golden age? And then, if you decide we're in one, what are the signs that we should be on the lookout to make sure that we can keep it?
Yes, I'm afraid that particular civilizations are defined as a golden age after it's lost its way. It's the subsequent generations who look back at something that they've lost and they wonder, how could they achieve these things, these freedoms, these wealth, these magnificent buildings made out of material we don't even understand? That must have been a golden age. So it's so in other words, it relates to the whole collapse question. To me, a golden age is an era when you see an explosion of creativity, many different innovations in different spheres of human life and technology at the same time, associated with cultural creativity, scientific curiosity, technological innovation, and economic growth, which then results in living standards and opportunities that are the envy of contemporary civilizations, but often of later civilizations as well. And yes, by that definition, I think we are in a golden age for sure. Since in the past 200 years, we've reduced extreme poverty from roughly 9 out of 10 people on the planet to less than 1 out of 10 today. We've increased life expectancy from 30 to 70 years, which tells me that this is the first time we have a golden age, which is not restricted to one region. Because of the expansion of liberal democracy, of rules-based, negotiation-based relationships with other nations, open trade and openness across borders, we've been able to make sure that technologies, ideas move across borders faster than ever before. And we should be happy to live in such a golden age and do our bit to keep this going. But there are signs that it is being threatened, and often it comes with the traditional horsemen of the apocalypse, military invasions, it's disease, pandemics, it's famine, crop failures, and so on. These are all elements that are worrying. But the one thing that really undermines it is comes from within. We can rebuild cities if they've been burnt down, but we cannot rebuild that sense of hope, energy, and innovation that defines a golden age. Once cultures, countries become so worried about the world, partly because of these very real disasters, so that they despair, that they replace the culture of hope and possibility with one of pessimism and despair. It often becomes self-fulfilling. They begin to search for scapegoats and hunt them down. They want to instill orthodoxies, create stability at any cost. They replace the Athenian mindset of going out there to find something new with a Spartan mindset, shutting the world out because it seems dangerous. And in that case, you turn off the taps of all that new energy, the new ideas and innovations that could have helped you to deal with these crises.
In the previous book, Open, you refer to anticipatory anxiety. Is that another phrase for what you just described? People so worried about the future, they want to shut off innovation and change?
Yeah, I think so. Anticipatory anxiety is not just any anxiety, which we can always feel for some reason or another, but this is the anxiety of anticipation. You're fearful of the future, what's unpredictable, what happens next. There's always something uncomfortable, obviously, with what happens next, and you want someone to give you the false promise of stability, safe, secure answers, easy, simple solutions. We always have that within us, I think, but especially in times of trouble, when the world seems dangerous, we often turn to some sort of strong man to give us something that seems secure and safe. But that's a false promise. It's always a false promise, because great civilizations are based on the crowdsourcing of new ideas, knowledge, experiments, and solutions. And whenever we replace that with the top-down commands of someone promising that they will save us all, we only replace that discovery process with the preference of a few people at the top. That's why it always reminds me of that old joke about the job interview. The guy walks up to the office and they look at his CV and it says, "Oh, you're quick at maths. So what's 16 times 17? Oh, that's 42. What? That's not even close." No, but it was quick. And that's the danger with demagogues, populists who tell you, if you just surrender your liberties, if you just surrender your freedoms, I will give you everything. That's just false, quick maths.
Now, we have a couple of questions coming up. One from India, Parth Shah, director of the Indian School of Public Policy, asks, in these varying civilizations, who played the role that we are trying to play in these times? What could we learn from their approaches and strategies and tactics?
Wow. Thank you, Parth. That's a great question. And I think that the role that we are playing in the liberty movement, that I'm trying to play and Atlas Network partners are playing, is a very important role. You can see them in all of these civilizations. People, individuals, sometimes philosophers like Cicero in Rome, or philosophers like Aristotle, but often the merchants, the civil servants, the politicians who are just trying to do the same thing, trying to talk about, look at the state we're in, don't take this for granted. This is based on very particular foundations and institutions, and we have to defend them. Unfortunately, I'm afraid they're quite often executed by the end of these civilizations. I don't want to bring people down, but there's often a death to Socrates moment at the end of these golden ages, when cultures sour on their tradition of intellectual openness and want to instill some sort of orthodoxy. But let's keep in mind, these cultures often faced decades and centuries of trouble and from natural disasters to civil strife, but they often overcame it. And it took a long time before they lost their way. And they managed to get through it if they had people who did what we're trying to do in the liberty movement, to constantly work hard and not take progress for granted.
Well, we owe to them the liberties that we enjoy today. I'll bring up, you mentioned in the book several places, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Egmont, the Count of Lamoral, who was beheaded for his defense of religious toleration and the openness of the Dutch Republic in 1598 by King Philip II of Spain, and then became a hero and inspired other people to continue this fight for liberty. And here I am today, his 11th great-grandson, hoping that we can continue that struggle for liberty. So they're great, inspiring figures, and in every civilization who've spoken up for these principles of liberty and justice. David Ansarov, go ahead.
That's an incredibly important point, because yes, he lost individually. He did the ultimate sacrifice for Dutch freedom. But he won in the end. Goethe wrote books about him, Beethoven wrote music about his experience, and he inspired other Dutch to stand up against the Habsburg Empire and find their freedom. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. And he managed to save his civilization. But even when they lose their civilization, they remain a source of inspiration to us. And I mean, that's sometimes a modest hope, but being able to sort of pass that torch or lifeline on to others, that's an incredible achievement as well.
Well, it's something that we should keep in mind. What is at stake in what we do also to defend these principles? David Ansarov from South Africa asks, what drives human progress more, technology or ideology?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really a chicken and egg question, because I'm sorry to disappoint, but we need both. Technology in itself, it's great, and it can also inspire ideas of optimism and encourage more experimentation and more growth. But eventually it often peters out unless there's a sufficient both a knowledge basis, but also the political, ideological structure that allows people to experiment. Many of these, we should have had the Industrial Revolution 400 years before it started in the British Isles. And because the Chinese were already there during the Song dynasty in the 12th and 13th century. They had produced all that iron and steel, and they had the textile machines, and they used water power, rotary power to encourage it. It could have happened then, but it lost its way because they lost their freedoms to continue to expand those technologies, to continue with the trial and error process that would have helped them to move on to the next step of the ladder. So to me, it's more like not circular, it's more like a spiral, a staircase, technology and the intellectual ideas of openness and of growth. We need both, and they support each other.
So Rejoice Ngwenya from Zimbabwe raises a question about what's happening in the United States right now, and America is standing with this very chilling moves towards protectionism, towards shutting down peaceful trade with other countries, the view that it's all a zero-sum game. If you gain, I lose. And for me to gain, you have to lose, rather than the positive-sum game that freedom advocates have always proposed. Voluntary trade is beneficial to both. That's why they trade. No one trades to get cheated. And he raises this question about the relationship between democracy and freedom. Is there can you end up democratically going in a direction that destroys your freedom?
Oh, for sure, you can. Democracy is more about how we make our decisions. It's not about the wisdom of those decisions. We need democracy because it's one way of restraining force in our societies, but we need other things as well. We need constitutional barriers to what the majority proposes. The Athenian Republic, the Athenian city-state was a democracy of sorts. Women and slaves weren't included, but it had astonishing degrees of popular participation in the rules. They also had a sense of a rule of law, but they didn't have strong constitutional barriers, strong divisions of power. They didn't have checks and balances that made sure that the majority couldn't do anything when they suddenly came up with an arbitrary decision. And that's why they decided to execute Socrates. That's why they decided to kill and enslave people in other Greek city-states, because the majority just fell for it. That's one reason why we need strong constitutions that always keep governments in check. And and speaking of the US today, obviously it's a worrying sign when the president is being asked whether he has to follow the Constitution, and says he doesn't know, and he'll ask his lawyers later. I mean, that's the whole point. That's why you swear an oath to the Constitution. I am worried about what is going on in the US, partly based on the rule of law decisions, and also the American approach to the world order. One reason why we've seen this explosion of growth and poverty reduction around the world is that America has helped to keep trade routes open and safe, and now it seems like it wants to bully countries into stopping handing cheap and productive inputs and intermediary goods to Americans. It's a very mistaken approach to economics, but it's also a way of undermining international relationships. And I hope they come to their senses soon.
I want to ask you a kind of a difficult question, and in just a few minutes, not everyone agrees with you. A lot of people out there on both the left and the right denounce all the things that you celebrate. So think about in France, the communist leader who might end up being president of France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who denounces everything you have endorsed and says it's a monstrous crime. And then the United States far-right philosophers like Patrick Deneen, who decry and denounce the openness, the free market exchange, toleration, willingness to innovate and to learn and even imitate other people, globalization. So why do you think they see the world differently from how you see it?
Well, if I were to give my opponents the benefit of the doubt and explain their best case, I wouldn't go to Mélenchon and Deneen and opponents like that, because they remind me more of the Voltaire joke of, I've only ever given one prayer to the Almighty, and that's, please make my opponents silly. And he's always granted my wishes. But there are serious people who don't agree with us, and who have other reasons, other experiences to think about this. And I think that one thing that I can sympathize with is that it's this anticipatory anxiety again. It is a difficult human condition to not know what comes next. What's the world going to look like? Where will I end up? What will happen next? There's something in us which craves guarantees and stability. And obviously, if we have too much of that, we end up in stagnation and in tyranny. But we also need to make sure that we have societies where everybody, or as many as possible, feel like they're included and part of society. And I think that oftentimes people who object to freedom and openness. They have experiences of groups who have ended up in situations that are quite difficult, and they want to find solutions for them. To me, I think those solutions, we find them better if they are empowered and they are given opportunities, and if we continue to experiment to find it. But I do sympathize with the ambition of making sure that everybody is included in the progress that we're trying to create as citizens. So that's one reason why we have to speak of them respectfully and not like Voltaire to talk about them as silly.
There's a number of questions that have been posed about topics you've addressed, about the lure of authoritarianism, of a strong man to make all the decisions for us, the zero-sum mentality replacing the positive-sum mentality that characterizes free societies where you benefit each other through voluntary exchange. And we have one here from Alexander Hammond from the United Kingdom and Switzerland. And he suggests that we champion the idea that individual liberty is essential for human flourishing. He gives some examples of that. But is openness the only path? He talks about the stability of the Pax Romana, which was an empire under Augustus and his successors. Is that the only path to a wealthy, powerful, innovative society? And if so, how does that nuance change the way we advocate for liberty in a world that's often tempted by the promise of coercive order, an emperor, a boss, a duce, a leader to impose order?
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. That's a great question. And I come down on the side that says that, yes, openness is the key to everything, because it is not one solution, it's not one blueprint. It's the way of saying that we don't know the best solutions to all our problems, and we have to stay open to learn the human condition, society, the economy, the history. It's a learning and discovery process by which we're trying to learn something new, what works, what doesn't work, and then to start again in a smarter way than before. That's what we need in every sphere of human experience, even when it comes to being good at using military force, because unfortunately sometimes we have to. Openness does not mean opening your borders to foreign military invaders. You have to stand up to Russian aggressors, for example. You have to stand up, as Athenians did, against the Persian invaders. But how you do that better if you are open to new solutions, new methods, constantly learning from others. That's what the Romans did. That's the Roman method of constantly improving. As Montesquieu put it, the great Enlightenment thinker, the one reason why the Romans became masters of the world was that they were quick to abandon their old ways and methods the moment they found something better elsewhere. And that's what we have to do, not just to continue to make progress, but also to stand up against evil.
I hope you'll join me in thanking Johan Norberg for such an interesting conversation, but also for the great books that he's written. This latest book, Peak Human, is just such a great read, full of insights drawn from many different disciplines, but applied to learning from history about how it's been done in the past and how to avoid the collapse of the present golden age. I also hope that you'll consider going to our Atlas Network website, that's atlasnetwork.org, and look into the Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner in Manhattan, November 12 to 13. It's an awesome experience to meet with great, enthusiastic freedom champions from all over the planet. I hope to see you there. Until then, stay free.